Now, let's try to understand what are the different types of motor neurons. Remember, this concept is very essential to understand the clinical features of upper motor neuron lesion and lower motor neuron lesion. So, motor neurons are broadly classified into what? It is broadly classified into upper motor neuron, and lower motor neuron. What exactly we understand by upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron? Let's try to find out. Now, let's try to draw the cerebral hemisphere. Let's imagine this is the cerebral hemisphere of one side. So here we have the cerebral hemisphere of the other side. Then let's say we have the part of brainstem. So let's imagine we have a part of brainstem, and then we have the spinal cord. Right? What is upper motor neuron? Remember, upper motor neuron always has its origin from the cerebral cortex. And from the cerebral cortex, it descends down through the entire brainstem. And when it reaches the medulla, at the level of lower medulla, it crosses to the opposite side, right? And then let's say it terminates in the spinal cord. This is what we refer to as upper motor neuron. The lower motor neuron begins from the anterior horn cell of the spinal cord, and then it reaches its target organ. So what is this? This is a lower motor neuron, whereas this is an upper motor neuron. So from the origin till it reaches the nucleus or the anterior gray horn of the spinal cord, we refer it to as upper motor neuron. Whereas lower motor neuron begins from the anterior gray horn of the spinal cord. Now, if you cut lower motor neuron, it basically results in flaccid paralysis. So lesions of lower motor neuron will lead to flaccid paralysis. Right? But whenever we have upper motor neuron lesions, right? Whenever we have upper motor neuron lesion, you still see some amount of contraction which is of no use. That is because the lower motor neurons are still functional, they can still trigger an impulse, but there is no meaning to that impulse because the upper motor neurons basically regulate the function of lower motor neurons and they regulate the function of lower motor neurons. So whatever function occurs that of lower motor neuron, it is entirely dependent on the upper motor neurons for their regulation from the higher cortical centers. This is how we classify the neurons as upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron. Right. Similar to this, when we talk about sensory neurons, even sensory neurons are broadly grouped into three distinct types. Now, what are they? These are divided into primary, right? Then we have secondary, and tertiary sensory neurons. Now, let's try to understand what exactly do we mean by primary, secondary, and tertiary order neurons. First, we will draw the outline of the spinal cord again. So imagine this is the spinal cord. We have the gray matter, right? And above, let's say we have the outline of the brainstem. That's the brainstem. And here, of course, we have the cerebral cortex. One other important component of cerebral cortex, let's say we have the thalamus. Right? So what do we mean by first order neuron? Remember, the first order neuron begins from a receptor and it is usually located in the dorsal root ganglion. So here is the neuron. Here is its dendrite passing to the cell body, and from the cell body the axon enters, and let's say through the dorsal column it ascends upwards into the brainstem and terminates. This is what we refer to as first order neuron. From first order neuron, begins the second order neuron. The second order neuron begins from the brainstem. Let's say it passes on to the opposite side or on the same side, ascends till it reaches the thalamus, and in the thalamus it terminates. This is what we refer to as second order neurons. And from the second order neurons, the third order neurons begin. The third order neurons begin from the thalamus and ends in the primary somatosensory area. Ends in primary sensory area, and this is referred to as the third order neuron. So first order neuron is from the receptor to the nucleus. And what is nucleus? It is collection of cell body inside the central nervous system. From the nucleus till the thalamus, we refer it to as second order neuron. And from the thalamus till it reaches the cerebral cortex, the primary somatosensory area, we refer it to as tertiary neuron. Right? All sensory neurons. Right? Remember, all sensory neurons except olfaction. Except olfaction. Remember, except olfaction, all sensory neurons will have these three orders of neurons. Olfaction will have only two orders of neurons because olfaction is the only sense that never gets relayed to thalamus. Otherwise, all other sensations, starting from touch to special senses, except olfaction, all of them have to relay into thalamus because thalamus is the ultimate sensory relay center. It receives all sensation, right? So apart from olfaction, all other sensory neurons are arranged like this as first order, second order and third order neurons. When we study the spinal tracts, right? The tracts of the spinal cord, the ascending tracts, this is the approach that we will use. What is the fate of first order neurons? Where do they cross over to the opposite side? What is the fate of second order neurons? And what is the fate of third order neurons? Where do they terminate? Right? This is the concept of first, second and third order neurons.